Welcome. This is Ann Kelly. I'm Vice President of Government Relations at Ceres, and I'm thrilled to give you all a warm welcome to our webinar this morning, which is an introduction to the Transportation and Climate Initiative with a special emphasis on opportunities for business input. We're thrilled to have so many of you joining us this morning, and I'm delighted to announce that we have all of the TCI states on the line. Chambers, both at the state and local level, are all represented today, which is terrific. There are so many of you on the call that we have muted all of your lines, and in a moment I'm going to explain how you can ask a question through the chat function. But let me say at the outset that we are recording this webinar, and each of you will receive a full recording with the slides so that you don't have to be frantically taking notes throughout. So just moving to our next slide, all of you have probably done this before on webinars. We're using ReadyTalk, and that enables you to ask a question at any time over in the lower left-hand corner through the chat function. And the speakers will see that question, and we will make certain that we answer each and every question. If we come to the end of the webinar and we still have questions to answer, we will make sure to get back to you individually. So the questions are going to be at the end of the webinar, but we will make sure and answer each and every one. Okay, so let's take a look at our agenda. This is just a very brief overview that I am talking about right now, and I'm absolutely thrilled with the collection of colleagues that we have on today's webinar. We're going to start out with our colleague from Georgetown Climate Center, Vicky Auroral. As most of you know, Georgetown have been the longtime experts on market-based solutions and multi-state programs. So we're thrilled to hear from Vicky. Then we'll hear from our colleague Bob Rio of AIM about why this policy and why now in particular. We'll then hear from our colleague J.D. Chesloff of the Massachusetts Business Roundtable about specific opportunities that will come from TCI investments. Then my colleague John Carlson will talk more about how you can participate and get more engaged. And then, as I said, we will be answering each and every one of your questions. So to kick us off, I'm thrilled to introduce Vicky Auroral, who is Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center. And Vicky, like all of our speakers today, deserves a much longer introduction than we are giving to her. You can certainly look her up. She is a legend. You probably know of her qualifications in this space. I'm thrilled to introduce her, and without further ado, Vicky, let me turn it right over to you.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Ann and Ceres and others who have come together to put on this webinar. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to tell you about our center and our work with the states, who are really the true leaders of the Transportation and Climate Initiative. For those of you who aren't familiar with our Climate Center, I just have a slide teeing up a bit of the background. We were launched over 10 years ago to serve as a resource to the states here in Washington, D.C., where we inform the federal dialogue in Washington with the lessons of states, and we serve as a resource to states and cities as well, especially on adaptation, I would say. But we work on issues both mitigating climate change and adapting to the consequences that we're already seeing, building resilience in our communities. We often work at the nexus of state and federal policies, from our perch here at Georgetown Law Center and also at the Hall of States, where we have an office. And we support the states through research, facilitation, convening, like this picture that you see here that happened to be not about the Transportation and Climate Initiative, but about the development of the Clean Power Plan, where then Administrator of the EPA, Gina McCarthy, and folks from industry, from the private sector, including utilities, NGOs, other think tanks, states from around the country came together and informed that particular policy. But we've worked on this in other sectors as well.
Excuse me, Vicky, if I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is Ann. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm just, we're getting just a little bit of feedback on the line, and I'm wondering if you're able to perhaps, I don't know if you're on a speakerphone or if you're able to switch to a landline, just a little bit of distortion with your voice. We don't want to miss a word of what you're saying.
I heard that when you were speaking earlier, and I wasn't sure if it was your line or ours. I am in a conference room, and it doesn't have a pick up the phone option. The only other option would be me calling in from the cell phone or something like that. Is this any better? I don't know. Can you hear me?
No, fair enough. We can hear you. You're certainly coming through, so why don't we just keep going? And as I said, we will, if we can make any correction on the distortion in the recording, we'll certainly do that. But you are coming through loudly. We're getting a little bit of feedback. So, no, by all means, keep going.
We've heard that too. I don't know exactly. I think it might have to do with the conference line. So anyway, the next slide, I think, related to transportation system benefits in general. Of course, transportation plays a role in our day-to-day lives and our economy. And the next slide goes to, sorry, we're having technical difficulties here now advancing the slide. Congestion is a major problem that affects people and businesses throughout our region, particularly in major metropolitan areas. This slide just references one particular study out of Texas, but that looks at the Philly metropolitan area and finds that drivers waste as much as 62 hours a year in congestion delay individual drivers on average. An estimated cost from congestion for consumers and commuters of over $1,000, and annual congestion costs for commercial trucks, up into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And this, of course, doesn't count all the air pollution impacts on quality of life and health, on human health. So in addition to the health impacts of air pollution in general, we're, of course, seeing the contribution of emissions from these vehicles helping to contribute to some of the impacts of climate change that we are seeing. 2019 is the fifth year in a row in which the U.S. has experienced at least 10 $1 billion plus disaster events, and this is only based on data through early October. Of course, in 2017, we saw disasters like Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria accounting for over $300 billion in costs. In 2018, there were 14 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disaster events across the U.S. with a total cost of $91 billion. So basically, over the last 3 years alone, we're seeing costs of over $450 billion, averaging $150 billion a year in disaster costs that are in part due to the climate changes that we're already seeing from the emissions of sectors like transportation. States in this region are participating in the Transportation and Climate Initiative, as you heard from Anne, as well as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And otherwise, many of the governors are showing leadership through new announcements on a regular basis about their own aspirational or other targets that relate to climate and clean energy. And you just see some of the headlines from some of those recent announcements here. Of course, they've also pushed back on some of the federal rollbacks to the federal climate policies as well. And the states in this region have ambitious targets on the books already through either legislation or executive orders or both in many cases. And the states recognize that they need to reduce transportation emissions in order to meet their economy-wide goals, which generally converge, as you see here, on an 80% reduction by 2050, in line with what the science tells us we need to do. So the next slide shows that transportation is the largest and growing sector of greenhouse gas emissions in the region. It's responsible for the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions, in part because the power sector is capped and there have been market shifts in that sector as well. So reducing transportation emissions is going to be really critical to meeting those states' economy-wide greenhouse gas goals and statutory requirements that I mentioned. So now for many years, actually back in 2010, we first launched the Transportation and Climate Initiative with states. That's what you see with the sign-on letter there, and some of the targets that they had in mind in an aspirational kind of way in the early days of the agreements between the commissioners of environment, energy, and transportation agencies from throughout this region, who we have been convening around tables like the one you see here for many, many years now. So we now have 12 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and D.C., with the addition of Virginia last year, working together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector and working on building a clean energy economy, finding the opportunities in this region to do that will create some win-wins. in terms of jobs and clean energy opportunities for the states to invest in and benefit from in terms of conventional air pollution as well. And of course, with something like transportation where people are moving from state to state, it's especially important for the states to pursue regional action to meet their own goals and to work together. The next slide shows some of the ways that they have worked together over the years, including through work groups on clean vehicles and fuels. To the left, you see our electric vehicle corridor analysis tool that's helping to make it easier for people like me who own electric vehicles to drive a car like my Bolt from jurisdiction to jurisdiction because they know that they'll have charging infrastructure there and available. With the states over the years, we've looked at the freight flows into and throughout the region to try to make those more efficient and to reduce some of the pollution that comes along with that. We've looked at what individual jurisdictions within the TCI region are doing to promote more active transportation alternatives, complete streets, more investment in sustainable communities through changes in land use, for example. We've also looked at use of communication technologies to promote the use of transit, and states in the region have shared best practices on that. And beyond the work groups that I just mentioned, the state leaders really back in, I would say, about 2012 started to express interest in really figuring out what they can do regionally that they might not be able to do within their own jurisdictions in terms of policy approaches. And so informed by some analysis that we did with Cambridge Systematics in 2015, states at the time who were participating in the Transportation and Climate Initiative from DC and Maryland up through Maine at the time, the states that are highlighted on this slide specifically announced that they would work together to develop potential market-based policy approaches that, when combined with existing programs, would achieve substantial reductions in transportation emissions and provide net economic benefits. So you see the slides at the time, the states, at the time who had joined forces to make that commitment, and there were supporting statements issued by Governor of New Hampshire at the time and by Ben Grumbles, the Secretary of Environment for Maryland. That announcement was actually informed by an analysis that I mentioned previously with Cambridge Systematics and our team here at Georgetown that showed that a policy, a theoretical policy, could create billions in economic growth. There would be potential for major emission reductions and health benefits while creating that economic growth. So that was, again, done in 2015. It informed that announcement for the states to work together on what that policy approach might look like. Additional analysis happened. We also had two large events in DC and in New York City that informed the deliberations of the states. We heard from diverse stakeholders, including many business leaders, at those big events in DC and around Climate Week in New York. We heard from retail and truck companies and folks who are investing in electric vehicles, as well as car companies and others, as well as other states and parts of the country and even beyond that had transportation policies that this region wanted to learn from. And the states decided in 2017 to announce a more robust public process that would really engage people in their communities, in their region. You see from this map that the additional states of Maryland and Massachusetts signed on to that statement in 2017. And those states, with our support, started in 2018 to reach out to literally thousands of stakeholders and people throughout the whole region and to invite individuals and networks to spread the word about 6 regional listening sessions that we had, and over 500 people turned out, we were happy to say, and we had about 100 state officials who also turned out to help facilitate these and hear what the citizens were saying about their own transportation challenges, the needs, and the opportunities that they see for having better alternatives right now for transportation, both in terms of their individual lives and commutes and family obligations to pick up their kids and get them to soccer games and school, what the goals for a future low-carbon transportation system for our region that also address these pollution issues as well might do, and how different types of policies and actions could help us meet those goals. So you see just some of the many sheets from brainstorming that we collected through that effort that went really throughout the course of 2018 and led to an important announcement at the end of last year that the group of states that you see listed on this slide would design a regional low-carbon transportation policy proposal that would cap and reduce carbon emissions from the combustion of transportation fuels, allowing each TCI jurisdiction to invest the proceeds into low-carbon and more resilient transportation. So that was a major announcement that catalyzed a lot of, fortunately mostly, I think, positive response that we also featured on our website. And I will say that in addition to building on the work of the TCI and the input that we heard from the listening sessions that we conducted, but also many of the states themselves have conducted in terms of outreach to their public, it was also informed by the success of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And so I think many of you are aware that the power sector has for some time now had an active program in place that caps the emissions from power plants of CO2 since 2009, and we're already seeing a reduction in emissions from that policy and other changes in that power sector of 50% reduction, and more is on the way given that the states in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative have revisited that cap over time and extended out to 2030 that program. At the same time, RGGI has boosted employment across the region. You see some of the figures here from an independent assessment of the economic benefits from keeping those dollars in the region, investing in weatherization programs, renewable energy, creating new jobs that can't be exported, as well as ultimately saving the consumers on their energy bills because of some of those investments, even with a modest price signal, and achieving over $200 million in net energy savings. And of course, this doesn't even quantify the significant public health benefits from the reduced air pollution in this region and the influence on climate forming pollution too, climate change pollution too. So similar to what we see with the RGGI program, the policy in the transportation sector would cap the emissions and require a reduction in the emissions over time. So we're looking at how we take the lessons from RGGI and apply it to a different sector where the TCI states are considering a program that would put a declining cap on the pollution from burning fossil fuels in this sector to reduce transportation emissions, requiring large gasoline and diesel fuel suppliers to hold allowances for the pollution that results from the combustion of the fuel that they sell to their customers. The policy could, as we saw with RGGI, raise significant proceeds to fund emissions reductions and improve transportation options and services. You see just some examples here: bike share programs, electric vehicle buses to get both people who rely on transit and children on school buses out of smelly diesel buses, port electrification, other ways that we can help to invest in solutions that reduce emissions and improve public health and provide alternatives to current transportation system options and ultimately lead to economic benefits and public health benefits. And of course, a multi-state system would still allow each state to invest the allowance proceeds in a way to meet their own specific needs. But these are just some of the options that came out as things that the public wanted when we had those listening sessions in 2018 and when we and the states conducted a lot more outreach just this year. So along those lines, you can see here, and you can go to the TCI website and see more detail in TCI's regional policy design process in 2019, which included additional stakeholder engagement, modeling and analysis, state working groups. The TCI states, I think it's fair to say, are pursuing, with our help, a very, very transparent process with significant engagement by the public, including business, including the fuel sector and vehicle manufacturers and others who might be affected by the policy, community members, environmental justice folks, and others who really want to be part of this process in designing a policy that would reduce emissions and improve transportation and mobility and create some public health benefits. So the next slide shows the early part of the timeline this year. We jumped right in after that December announcement to finalize an original work plan for this year that has been updated in October. You see the middle phase in April to July included initiating some new modeling and analysis, conducting further stakeholder engagement in the form of very large public sessions, workshops that I'll go into in a minute, and coordinating decision-making activities, including through a public input portal where people could offer their comments. So back in April, we initiated the public dialogue this year about a Cap and Invest program, bringing together state officials and experts who are helping to do the modeling to have a conversation about the policy design options and the modeling strategies for evaluating both the costs and the benefits of a Cap and Invest program for this region. The next event was in Newark in May 2019. It was a second workshop where we prioritized hearing from frontline communities, particularly those in New Jersey, some of whom had not participated as much previously because, as you might recall, the last administration, the Governor Christie administration, was not as active and, in fact, had pulled New Jersey out of RGGI, for example. So that part of the region might not have been as fully engaged, shall we say, in transportation and other efforts to reduce pollution in that administration. This new administration under Governor Murphy has been very engaged, and we had this workshop to make sure that their community members were also very well aware of these conversations that were going on. But in addition to community members, we also had several representatives of businesses and from throughout the region as well, I should say. The next public workshop was in Baltimore, and it included an update from the states themselves on the policy development process at the time. We also heard from experts on environmental, health, and economic benefits of a regional program and the associated investments that might be made in the communities. We've discussed strategies for setting investment priorities and ways to measure and evaluate the program's performance. And we looked at how a regional Cap and Invest program and potential complementary policies could work together. We also, I should say, live streamed these events. So 1,000 people presented or attended, I should say, in person or online through the live stream. They participated. These are also recorded and available for others. Many states continue to conduct their own outreach and public workshops as well. And we've also had some webinars throughout the year to share some information on our modeling, including looking at different scenarios for the reference case. The next slide is a little wonky, but basically just makes the point that the Transportation and Climate Initiative team, and I've got colleagues here who can answer more detailed questions. Joe Kruger, our Director of Research and Strategy, can talk about this in more detail if people are interested, but we've got both people on our staff and external to our center who are working to inform the states as they make these decisions through conducting analysis that looks at both potential costs of a program as well as benefits, including looking at some of the public health benefits that would be achieved through reductions in transportation emissions. Going forward on the timeline, you see here that by August and November, we were in a position to really begin reviewing and summarizing some of the input that we were seeing from stakeholders and to reflect that back in an announcement and a milestone, I would say, just last month, releasing a framework for more discussion of a draft regional policy proposal that would be released later this year, continuing to gather and consider public input from state events and from our online portal. The release of that framework that happened on October 1st was met with some excitement, I would think it's safe to say. You see some of the headlines here. In addition to the program framework, we issued a timeline that goes out a bit further than we had earlier in the year, a modeling memo that goes into a bit more detail about the modeling teams that we've engaged, and as I mentioned, summarized at a very high level what we've been hearing so far. So on the draft framework that was released, I won't go into it in detail. It is available on the website, and hope you have had a chance to take a look. But these are just some of the headlines, some of the topics that are covered in that framework. And equity is a theme that we've been hearing about, both in terms of folks from communities that have been disproportionately affected by pollution from this sector, but also for those who might have to drive long distances just to live their lives, people in rural areas, for example, making sure that the way that this policy is crafted really considers how those communities might be affected by the policy and how those communities might be able to benefit from some of the investments that might be generated by the policy. So the statement acknowledges the current inequities in some of the region, including accessibility and affordability and public health risks, and makes a commitment to work with those communities as we have through this process to design a program that would work for all, looks at the affected fuels, looking at targeting the emissions of carbon dioxide from the combustion of fossil fuels of motor gasoline and on-road diesel. The jurisdictions acknowledge that they're still considering how and whether to include biofuels in the program. It also identified regulated entities as state fuel suppliers who would include owners of fuel at terminals in a TCI jurisdiction or position holders, if you will, pretty high up in the system. So we're not doing anything at the level of the cars or at the stations that sell the gasoline, for example, but this is really going to be a policy that affects the owners of the fuel delivered into the region for ultimate sale and consumption. There are reporting requirements that are sketched out at a high level. Fuel suppliers would be required to report on their emissions, and it would be based on current federal and state reporting programs. There would be a regional cap that would be made up, and the individuals would have allowance budgets for the participating jurisdictions. There would be an initial cap set at a level that would decline every year at a rate to be determined by the TCI jurisdictions. There's language in there about auctioning allowances that helps to not only send the price signal but also generate revenues for the investment in this sector. And then again, the investment in proceeds would allow each jurisdiction to decide how the proceeds would achieve carbon reduction goals as well as other policy goals of the state. It could also go to shared priorities like working together on issues that have a regional focus, like improving the movement of freight throughout the region, electric vehicle corridors, and public transit. And then recognizing that TCI is not a program that in and of itself would be sufficient to meet all of the state's goals, the states have acknowledged that they'll be working on other policies as well. And many of these states, of course, do have other policies that are relevant on the books already. So that's just a very, very high-level overview of the program development process. This is a timeline moving forward from the release of that framework document. The states announced that they plan to release a draft MOU. They will be taking additional public input in the new year. After they do that, they will release a final MOU sometime in the spring of next year, at which point each jurisdiction will decide whether to sign on to that MOU and participate in a regional program. I will say every jurisdiction in TCI, not just those that signed on in December, but every jurisdiction has been at the table in these discussions this year and certainly has a voice if they wish to use it in helping us craft this policy proposal. Here you see the next phase after next year, or beyond, I should say, next year. The states would go on, like with the RGGI experience, to develop a model rule. In some cases, the legislatures will want to be involved or might need to be involved. And ultimately, we might see a rulemaking process to adopt regulations playing out in 2021 and implementation then as early as 2022. Just to reiterate that we're continuing to hear from people and businesses and other stakeholders through a public online portal that is still open for comment. We have heard from many organizations, including some on this call, so I want to thank you for that. It's not an exhaustive list, but this list just shows you a representative sample of the really diverse organizations and individuals who've been submitting input since really before that October 1st deadline or date, I should say, of the release of the framework, but have been able to be more granular in their recommendations with the framework release, and we are still taking comments. And so, for more information, feel free to reach out to me. We should have the coordinates for the Transportation and Climate Initiative website here, but it's basically transportationandclimate.org, I believe, and look forward to hearing from the other speakers and answering any questions.
Well, Vicki, thank you so much. That was tremendous. And I know our listeners know that I wasn't kidding when I said how fluent you were in this space. I can't say enough about how you and the Georgetown Climate Center have just been a phenomenal resource on this topic. And for our listeners, what Vicki just gave us is a fraction of what she actually knows in this space, so I highly recommend you connecting with Georgetown for more information and details on TCI. I want to welcome your questions again. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, there is a chat function here. We are taking those questions. We are curating those. We'll be doing Q&A at the end of the webinar today, which is scheduled to end at 12:30. So please do send your questions forward. And thank you so much, Vicki, and thank you for staying on the line for our Q&A. All right, so moving on now, we're going to talk a little bit more about the collaboration that has emerged. And I'll tell you, I've been working, I worked in the Commonwealth for 25 years. I used to work for the state. Never have I seen this beautiful set of colorful logos on the same page, literally, with a statement that says we are united by the once-in-a-generation opportunity to modernize and decarbonize our transportation system. This was really monumental and is important because these groups, the Associated Industries of Massachusetts, Ceres, ELM, the Massachusetts Business Roundtable, and the Massachusetts Taxpayers Association have never together agreed on, well, anything actually, but in particular coming together to say we've gotten to a point with our transportation emissions and our congestion that we need to work together. And so I'm honored and thrilled that we have a few of our colleagues with us today and that we are really forming a united front on this mission we share. Ceres' angle on this, just for a little bit of background, we actually are in the business full-time in the policy network here of mobilizing the business voice and bringing it to state lawmakers. My colleague, Allie Gold-Roberts, directs a program in 14 states around the country that is very specifically aimed at leveraging the compelling economic-based business voice to lawmakers to push for thoughtful, compelling climate and energy policy, and of course that has to cover the transportation sector. So we are also a resource in that regard, but we couldn't be more happy to be collaborating with partners on TCI because it's clearly the initiative whose time has come. And next, I'm thrilled to introduce our good friend, Bob Rio, who is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for AIM, the Associated Industries of Massachusetts. Great to have you here, Bob, and why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much, Ann. Just for people, I know a lot of people on the line, but just for background, AIM is the largest trade association or the largest general trade association in Massachusetts. We are statewide, and all industries are eligible to be members of AIM. And I think that puts us in a unique position on this. We have members, obviously, in the eastern part of the state where congestion and lack of public transportation or inadequate public transportation is very important, along with sustainability practice focused around climate. And we have people in the western part of the state who are more, or central and western part of the state, who are more traditional manufacturers who may, not be. Public transportation isn't a big thing out there, but they need access to goods and services and the ability to get employees to their companies, and they're interested in it for different reasons. So it's important that this is a transportation and climate initiative because, frankly, one without the other would not be something AIM would be able to support. And I think the principles that we have up there really show the breadth of this whole thing. The second one in particular, it must be fair to all income levels in all regions of the Commonwealth. That's really one of AIM's principles because we need it fair around the state. It's easy to push things into eastern Massachusetts or western Massachusetts, but this has to be fair to everybody, and I would encourage those on the line who are statewide associations to really pay attention to that to get everybody to buy into it. And of course, the first one, cleaning up our transportation system and decarbonizing it and making it better and reducing congestion are all part of this whole thing too. So we really do believe that we have to reduce greenhouse gases related to transportation. Just go to the next one. This was obviously a slide that Vicky had, so I'm not going to talk about it other than to say in Massachusetts, the numbers, about 45% of our carbon emissions are from transportation. And I think it's important to note that Massachusetts has a greenhouse gas law on the books that requires an 80% economy-wide reduction in carbon emissions. And the electric sector, which used to be the highest, has, through RGGI and also through in-state reductions, is on its way to zero actually. We're certainly going to hit 80. We have offshore wind coming on board, like a lot of the a lot of the states on this call. We have hydropower coming down. Already on the books, we're scheduled to get to 80%. So other than implementing those policies from the electric sector, we are there. And over the next couple of years, we'll start seeing all that ramp up. So obviously, we have to focus on transportation because we won't make our greenhouse gas policies. And in fact, we won't solve our transportation issues. Next one. And, again, you saw this in an earlier slide, but the important point here is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the emission reduction goals. You can skip this one because I just talked about that. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, Vicky talked about this, but the one thing I want to point out is that the revenue from this program in Massachusetts has been put towards energy efficiency programs exclusively. So similar to TCI, where the revenues will be reinvested into the state, RGGI has resulted in energy efficiency improvements in Massachusetts. I believe about 80% of it actually does go to our energy efficiency program. So that has been very important to keep the circle going and reducing the energy. So I highly recommend that as these programs start being developed, that those of you who are on chambers and state associations, you make sure that the money goes to the right places as it has for RGGI, because that ultimately is what's going to solve the problems. And a couple of lessons learned under RGGI that we will be talking about as TCI gets developed is the cap needs to be well thought out, particularly in the first couple of years. RGGI, when it first started, the cap sort of meandered a little bit and stayed fairly constant until things got ramped up. And I think as a state association, we have to make sure that this is not too abrupt, that the cap is, consistent with the ability to reduce the use of, in this case, of gasoline and diesel fuels. So as a state association, as a statewide association, our goal in this is to make sure that the policies being implemented at the state level really do meet the needs of the state, transportation-wise, climate-wise, to comply with our goals, and also meet the needs of the individual employers and employees. So that is what I would caution everybody on this call, is to get involved in the program and get involved in the policy making, because the worst thing that can happen is the program to come out and people be disadvantaged by it unnecessarily. I believe that's it. That's it for me. If there's any questions, my name is at the end of the program.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for that. And again, I can't say enough about how helpful it is to have AIM, Associated with Massachusetts, behind this effort. And I'm really glad you kicked off with the notion of fundamental fairness, because I'm sure other states on the call, like Massachusetts, have a range of issues when it comes to the rural and the urban areas. They're very different. And you're also right to call for engagement and action. I mean, we very much want the business voice at the table as this starts to take shape. So thank you so much for your comments. And again, questions in the lower left-hand corner in the chat function. Feel free to keep sending those in, and we will address each and every question before the end of the webinar. So now I'm thrilled to introduce our other good friend, J.D. Chesloff, who is Executive Director of the Massachusetts Business Roundtable. And I understand from looking at the names on this call that J.D. is no stranger to many of you. We're thrilled to have you joining us, J.D., and look forward to your comments.
Great. Thank you, Ann. And good morning, everybody. So just for those of you who don't know, I'm J.D. Cheslaw from the Massachusetts Business Roundtable. We are a public policy organization comprised of CEOs and senior executives from large companies and, like AIM, a statewide organization. The mission is to strengthen the state's long-term economic vitality with the goal of making Massachusetts a better place to do business. So we engage on a whole variety of issues around education, healthcare, energy, tax policy, like a lot of you folks on the phone. But increasingly and lately, we've been much more engaged and primarily engaged in transportation policy. On the next slide, I kind of get into why, right? So the basic reason why we're engaged is because we keep hearing from our members that this is a top priority. I spend every summer meeting one-on-one with members of the roundtable and ask them, what's going on in your business? What's going on in your industry? What are your top issues? And over the past year or two, transportation has been the number one issue. I hear a lot about workforce, as the rest of you do, but transportation has become the number one issue for our folks. So then we start to survey them on different initiatives in the transportation space. We asked specifically about TCI. We were very upfront about the fact that TCI would show up as an increase in gas at the gas pump. And even with that, a large majority of our folks, 73%, supported it. We then asked, okay, so if we have new revenue coming in from whether it be from TCI and or other sources, where would you like to see it spent? And again, a large majority, 89%, say they want to see it invested in public transportation. So when we were asked to participate in the collaboration that Ann referenced, it was kind of a no-brainer at that point. So we took all this information and laid out the framework for how we as a roundtable are going to engage in the state's transportation policy discussion. And so we framed it with just this overarching goal. Why are we doing this? Why does this matter to us? And basically it was to improve transportation mobility options and reduce the impact of transportation emissions on climate change. That's the broad goal. Then we said, okay, what is the strategy to implement that goal? And we talked a lot about implementing these pricing strategies that not only would encourage the use of alternatives to driving, but strategies also that would help to reduce carbon emissions. And then we sort of framed it around this rationale about, okay, we believe as an organization that additional near and longer term resources are needed to make investments in a whole variety of ways to meet our goal. What was interesting for us about TCI is that it really checked all three of these boxes, and again was a no-brainer in terms of if we should get engaged. So as I think about what are some of those investment opportunities, we're actually involved in another collaboration that identified investing in public transportation and mass transit networks as an important priority. And it talked about accelerating investments to improve mobility, mitigating congestion, reducing emissions, and delivering on other improvements and projects over the next few years, and specifically identified TCI as a function to raise those funds and make these investments. As Bob said, there is a regional equity component to this, where we can get funds to all areas of the state, and we agree with Bob that that is a very, very high priority. And for those of you who have rural areas, not just in addition to your urban areas, it's very important to continue to make that case. I think Bob was right on about that. So mass transit clearly is an area where our folks think it's important to invest TCI funds. There are a lot of other states, by the way, who are not as invested in public transportation, but are moving forward with other technologies such as electric vehicles. That is another area for investment from TCI funds, charging networks and other incentives for EVs and fleet electrification. And when you're in a business association like ours and you have members who have large fleets, such as utilities or cable companies, these are all really important conversations, not only about the impact at the gas pump, but also what does the future of those fleets look like. And then finally, I just want to amplify a point that Bob and Ann both have made, which is really in the end, The primary value to being involved in the conversation at this time is to make sure we're at the table as these decisions are being made. That really is what it comes down to. There are going to be a lot of decisions made about the cap, as Bob referenced, about where the money is spent, as we've all been referencing. And to have a seat at that table and to be part of those conversations and to bring the business perspective and bring business concerns to those conversations is extremely valuable. And I would highly recommend that folks engage as soon as they can and as often as they can. I would also mention that the model that we have here of engaging with the environmental community as partners is a really interesting model. I think because of the unlikely ally message it sends, it does get us a seat at the table. We were actually, I hope I'm allowed to say this, asked in by our governor as a group to sit down and talk to him about, okay, this is a really interesting collaboration you guys have formed. How can we work together? I will just say that just for this last point, the Georgetown Climate Center has done a lot of great research about potential results from impacts investments of TCI funds. There's a few listed here. There's going to be an update of some of the research next month. We'll all be keeping an eye out for that as we continue to think about the best investment options for TCI funds.
Thank you so much, JD, and a special thanks for reinforcing the power of our collaboration together, which we certainly feel as well. It feels as though we're pretty unstoppable at this point. And your presentation is really one of the most exciting because then I see we're getting a lot of questions about the investment opportunities. Where is this money going to go? How can we spend it? And that is an exciting conversation, and we're going to be able to answer those questions again in the Q&A. Feel free to use the chat function. And again, we appreciate your partnership, and also we're excited about working with some of your partners in some of the other states as well in the region. And now I'm thrilled to introduce my colleague, John Carlson. He is a manager of state policy here at Ceres, and he is our lead on the TCI project overall, and he's going to talk to us a little specifically about what happens from here and how you can get engaged. So take it away, John.
Thank you, Ann. I appreciate it. As Ann mentioned, I'm the lead at Ceres on TCI under her leadership with a bunch of my colleagues and, of course, the illustrious partners you've heard from today. But I do manage a lot of the day-to-day work that we do on TCI, which is one of the reasons why after this webinar, you will all be getting an email from me with PDF slides of this presentation and an offer to continue the dialogue and work with you all. As you've heard so far today, a lot of very smart and driven stakeholders have spent several years now looking at the evidence of what works and developing this policy that is both viable, practical, and can really help address several of the greatest challenges facing our region at once. But now that that framework has been designed and is about to go public and move to the next stage, we are entering this moment where a lot of our members and our stakeholders across the region are really hearing about it and learning about it for the first time, be that those of you who are on the call today, the members of your various organizations. And we really want them to understand because this can be a somewhat complicated policy, and we would really appreciate the opportunity to help you with those education efforts. We have been developing these kind of materials for several years now. We have webinars, we have one-pagers, we have statements, anything that you might need to help you craft your message and pass it along to your members. We're here to work with you and to help you with that process. And it's not just your members. This process has mostly been driven by executive agencies in all of the states. So legislators in most states are also hearing about it for the first time. And it would be great if they can understand the benefits that the business community sees from a program like this. And even beyond just the legislative branch, it's often been particular agencies or offices within the administrations. And so just spreading this knowledge and this opportunity to all the policymakers you work with, and to be supporting it with the key voices that you bring to the dialogue can have a major impact. As we shift to this next step where the additional modeling and draft of the MOU is released in the coming weeks, We're going to have more data that Georgetown and the states will be providing about what can be expected about all this. But there's also going to be new opportunities opening up in each of your states. Expect there to be stakeholder forums or portals for official public comments. And those are all things that we look forward to helping you bring your voice to. And then, as has been noted repeatedly, eventually a great deal of revenue is potentially going to be generated through this program. And the decision of how to direct that revenue and where the investments will go will be guided by principles that all the states agree on, but will really be left to the individual states' decisions. And that is a key place where your voice can matter and can help decide what process is used to guide those investments and to make sure that they're having the greatest impact on all of the challenges that we see in front of us. The last slide that I think we have before we move to questions is just links to a few different resources. Obviously, on the webinar might not be as useful, but you will be getting a PDF of this presentation, and all these are clickable links. Our Transportation Future is a coalition of groups across the region, advocates, scientific groups, business, environmental, who are all engaged on the TCI policy and have been contributing different materials on that website as well. The next one you see is a link to earlier report that Georgetown Climate Center had done. This was some of what was referenced by JD at the end of his presentation. That report does have a lot of useful information, but it does date to 2015. So we're really looking forward to the update coming soon. And then lastly, so you can see an example of the kind of congratulations, this working group of AIM and the Mass Business Roundtable and Taxpayers Foundation, along with Ceres and ELM, have gotten. This is the Boston Globe article highlighting that collaboration. And we're really hoping that with the future collaboration with all of you, we can see similar, a lot of very headlines in states across the region. So thank you for your interest and engagement.
Well, thank you, John. Really appreciate that. And I just want to remind our listeners one more time that you can ask questions through our chat function in the lower left-hand corner. We're going to jump into those questions in a moment, but I also want to remind you as we go into Q&A that this entire webinar is being recorded. You will receive a copy of it, so again, you don't have to take frantic notes when you hear the answers to our questions. So we're going to dive into Q&A now, and again, thanks to all of our panelists who've stayed with us till the end, and I'm going to kick off with a question that I think is really for Bob and for JD. This is a general one. It's coming in a few different forms, but in a nutshell, talk a little bit about how you have updated and or engaged your members and, what kind of feedback you've been getting from any of your members, what their initial reaction is, what questions they may have. I think lots of people are interested in your answers.
Sure. This is JD. So we've been updating our members consistently through our normal channels, whether it be our Energy Task Force, our Executive Committee, or our board. I will also say, though, before I get into what they're saying, we have a very collaborative business community here. And it's not just the three of us who are engaged. There's a group called the Mass Competitive Partnership, which is another CEO organization, which has been really, really engaged and has made climate a priority. They've been terrific partners. The Retailers Association of Massachusetts here also is engaging and learning and updating their members as well. So there's been a lot of retail education done within the organizations, and then I would say some wholesale done where we all are reaching out to our members, keeping them updated on what's going on. When the framework came out, that was distributed. We're hosting an event next month for business leaders across the Commonwealth with the governor and a couple of cabinet secretaries. So it's a well-conceived, thoughtful strategy to make sure that our folks are up to date. They know what's going on. They have opportunities to engage and ask questions. And so far, I think the guiding principle is no surprises. So let's keep them updated on what's happening.
Bob?
Yes. Thank you, JD, for that and bringing in and making sure the other groups are also commended on this. As a statewide association, the messaging is different depending on who you're talking to. The largest buildings in Boston are probably banks, insurance companies, financial institutions, and as a direct cost to them, this probably is not a big cost as a direct cost, since they probably don't move a lot of goods around. But when you get to the western part of the state and the central part of the state, where people do move a lot of goods and they travel longer distances, the message has to be a little bit different. So we're tailoring our message depending on who our members are. Obviously, in the eastern part of the state, it might be more centered around the climate issue and congestion issue, as well as major investments in public transportation, which Boston has a pretty good transportation system. Whereas in the western part of the state, we talk about, enhanced regional transportation and conversion over to alternative vehicles that will save money in the long run. So, we've been going through blogs, op-eds. We haven't ramped up regional meetings, but we will. And the idea is to tailor the message to the type of company or industry that you're talking to, because everybody does come at this just a little bit differently.
So thank you so much for that, Bob. And JD, thank you for reminding us of our other partners, which actually also include the Boston Chamber of Commerce as well. Very much a collective business effort. And Bob, we have another question that builds on your answer, actually, about the movement of goods. Someone has written in to say, and maybe this question is for you, Vicky, how is TCI going to reduce freight costs for supplies, for goods and goods for manufacturers and other transportation-dependent businesses? Do you have any sense of that and freight costs, Vicky?
Well, sure. So, obviously what we're talking about here is a cap on transportation emissions that would create a price signal, likely a minus one, that, is certainly within the kind of swings that we usually see, right? And things that the states and all of us have very little control over when you see gas and diesel spikes due to geopolitical events or climate events like hurricanes that take out some of the production. So the idea is to take that investment and put it into policies that help to reduce congestion, that provide alternatives for businesses as well as consumers, including investment in electric vehicle corridors, so people know that they can get from point A to point B with alternative fueled vehicle. In urban areas, you see the use more and more of electric vehicle delivery trucks. So that could be something that over time helps to both reduce pollution as well as the cost, because the power is actually a lot cheaper than fossil fuel costs from the current fuels. And again, the whole point of the design of the program from the investment point of view in TCI is that each state would tailor the kind of measures that make sense for their businesses and communities. So I would just encourage the person asking the question to work with the state and talk about what the priorities are in helping to ease that transition and promote a transition to cleaner fuel. But the congestion relief benefits that we assume will be part of the program based on earlier modeling should also help to improve the cost of doing business for everybody who needs to actually transport goods and services across states.
Okay, thank you so much, Vicki. And while you have the mic, I'm going to toss another one your way that I think is of broad interest to our callers. How are the various states reacting to TCI? And for those that might be a little bit skeptical, how can the business community engage to help overcome that skepticism? And any thoughts you have? And JD and Bob, if you have thoughts as well, that'd be fine.
Sorry, Ann, I missed the beginning part of that.
Oh, I apologize. Let me repeat. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear enough. I'm getting closer to the mic. The question is, how are the various states reacting to TCI? And for those that may be somewhat skeptical, and by this I mean the state, at the state government level, how can the business community in those states engage to help overcome that skepticism?
Oh, well, that's great. I mean, as I said, what's encouraging is that states beyond those that signed on to the December commitment to, work on this process this year and to deliver a policy proposal by the end of this year, all the states in the TCI region and the District of Columbia have been at the table for these conversations. But, clearly the ones who signed on to that agreement have a little bit more running room, if you will. So, I mean, I think it's important for all of them throughout the region, from D.C. and Virginia all the way up through Maine, to hear from their constituents, including especially, I would say, businesses who might be supportive of this policy might be able to articulate what they are interested in seeing in this policy and how it's crafted, because, of course, the design details still have to be worked out and will still have to be worked out even after a high-level MOU agreement will be out there for additional public comment. So I would say there's going to be ongoing opportunities for you through the TCI process regionally, but I would definitely encourage you to reach out to your states, some of whom are already having their own public meetings on this, but also where we're well aware of people from the business sector and others reaching out to meet with people in the state agencies. And I'll just remind you that it's sort of unprecedented, really, that not just the energy and environment officials who've been working together for years in RGGI, but now the transportation agencies have been a really integral part of this. And I think, we've been at the table with them for a long time, but of course, now that things are getting more and more real, I think, they're paying more attention to it, but don't really have the same kind of background in how these policies might work. And so I think it's especially important, for those of you who have relationships with the DOTs to talk to them about how you think this policy will benefit your community and your businesses and how it can be crafted in a way that creates those win-wins.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Bob, did you want to jump in?
Yes. I'm speaking from Massachusetts, obviously, but Massachusetts will be transforming our transportation system. That is a law. We have to comply with the greenhouse gas reduction law, and the way to do that is to convert mostly to alternative vehicles, primarily electric. So this goes to the previous question, really, is that, this is not going to happen on some date certain where all of a sudden, costs are going to go up 40% and everybody's going to have to get rid of their internal combustion engine. This is a ramp up, so to speak, or a ramp down on the cap and a ramp up on alternative vehicles. So the idea, as we engage on it, is to make a company sort of agnostic about the mode of transportation. So, for instance, to the person who talked about moving goods and services, the hope is that these investments can make an alternative vehicle, financially a good idea, basically. Viable is a better word. Thank you, JD. Financially viable, so that the person doesn't care really whether they're driving an electric vehicle or an internal vehicle. And obviously, if you drive an electric vehicle, you're not going to pay TCI fees anymore, since you're not going to be using gasoline. And in fact, in Massachusetts, you won't pay gas taxes anymore. So the hope is that, just like we've done on the energy efficiency program, we're trying to make that person agnostic as to what they drive. Now, it's going to take some time, it will take a lot of input from everybody around the state to make sure that they get what they need, depending on where you are. As a statewide association, we have members that are, 2 people, and we have members that are, 5,000 people, and each one has individual needs. And the idea is to really meet with them and get input into the developers to make sure that all of them are met. But it's not going to be, 2021 or 22, everything changes. This is a 20-year transformation, and that's why we believe it can work.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. And now a question that I think is on several minds of several callers. And Vicki, I think you may have a range here to offer. How much revenue are we talking about when it comes to TCI? And I'm wondering if you can comment on the first year or the first 5 years. Any sense of the revenue to be generated here in the modeling that you're looking at?
So, yeah, thanks for the question. The earlier analysis that I mentioned, the Cambridge Systematics one, was really based on a theoretical program. The difference now is that the states actually are engaged in a conversation about all those aspects about the design framework that I went over, including how aggressive to set the cap. And, of course, what you assume about that will determine what the price might be and what is generated in terms of revenues. I think it's safe to say on a regional basis we would be looking at, in the billions somewhere, probably not, hundreds of billions, but, at least at the low end of that. And as you see with RGGI, really it's a story of how you've invested that really ends up driving some of the win-win opportunities that we've seen, both in terms of jobs as well as in terms of reducing conventional air pollution and climate through the ways that those proceeds have been invested. And again, really encourage folks to engage with the states, because your input in crafting those investment strategies in a way that hopefully will produce even more reductions than would come from the price signal alone, and other co-benefits that will be really critical.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Okay, questions are coming in quickly, furiously. As I noted, if for some reason we haven't answered your question from the chat, we will answer it directly via email following the webinar. And once again, this is recorded and you'll have all of these answers. This question goes a little bit to equity, which Bob and JD and Vicki all spoke about. Basically, prices are going to go up at the pump somewhat. And so for Bob and JD and Vicki, how are you talking about this to either lower income individuals or to companies that have very large fleets? How are we talking about that at the pump gas increase? And I'll turn to anybody who'd like to take that first.
Sure, and I'll start. We actually had this conversation amongst our membership. A couple of thoughts. One is just starting first with the companies with large fleets. It was a really interesting conversation because they're doing a cost analysis about the condition of the transportation infrastructure and the costs associated with that versus the costs associated with an increase of gas at the pump. And maybe not surprisingly, maybe yes surprisingly, they actually are supporting this because they feel like the investments in transportation infrastructure offset the cost of having a poor transportation infrastructure. Not an easy conclusion to come to for any of them because it is a cost, as some folks have referenced. But there also is a benefit to the investment. And I think as they do that cost-benefit analysis, they're finding that this is something they could support. Regarding the lower income people, it's been an interesting conversation. Other states that have looked at increases in gas taxes, for example, not specific to TCI, but have done other offsetting tax changes that help lower income people. So for example, in Tennessee, they raised the gas tax, but at the same time, they reduced the sales tax on groceries. They allowed for a housing tax credit for veterans. And they thought about offsets that would specifically impact and help Tennesseans. Similarly, there's been conversation here. Some advocacy groups are supporting the notion of increasing the earned income tax credit as an offset. So there are ways to think about how do you provide some relief for low-income people or others who would be impacted by an increase of gas tax at the pump.
Yeah, that's great, JD. And this is Bob Rio from AIM. We looked at other options too. Not just TCI. There's always what do you do if you didn't do TCI? And that's what we have to explain to our members too, including the fleet people, is that, Massachusetts has committed to greenhouse gas reductions as many states have. And the question is, how do you get there with the least amount of pain? And we believe that these kind of investments that JD was just talking about and everybody else talked about is the best way to do it. Now, there may be other ways that would impact people differently or better or worse. However, we settled on this one because we think it does meet some of the shared goals that many of our members. By the way, we have a lot of common members, and so working with them has been also very easy to do since, we're all working towards the same goal.
Thank you, Bob. And let's stay on this topic for a moment on pricing. Another set of questions around the price at the pump. How would the price at the pump vary based on fluctuations in the economy? And a related question, does the panel think that TCI would actually be less burdensome than a potential gas tax at the pump? And I'll offer that to any of the three of you that want to jump in on that.
Yeah, AIM has not supported the gas tax, but has supported TCI. And the reason is because we believe the investments that came out of the money for a gas tax is set by statute and by the Constitution, in fact, in Massachusetts, and it can't go to things like electric vehicles and charging stations and things that reduce greenhouse gases. So, we had supported this because the money will be invested in reducing greenhouse gases. So you get sort of a double bang for the buck. You don't just get more roads. You, in fact, get, a climate a reduction in greenhouse gases, which is very important for our businesses. So, a gas tax we don't think would check all the boxes, whereas the TCI, we believe, by investing the proceeds in, would work like Reggie, which has been very successful.
Thank you, Bob. Anything to add, JD or Vicky?
So this is Vicky. I actually wanted to jump in a little bit on the last question as well. So let me just say that, how, and it relates to this because it relates to, how do you deal with the price, including for low-income individuals, as the last questioner asked, or the fluctuations here. And I will say, part of what this would allow folks to do is to deal with the cost variation and the shocks that affect us all now that, do not have anything to do with these policies, and, where you're not capturing those revenues to spend in the region on things like, complete streets that make it safer for people to bike and, use transit safely, or pedestrian transit is more safe, investment in safer and more reliable transit and more lines, options to get people, including lower income people, into cleaner vehicles through Cash for Clunkers programs, or buying down the cost of a new or gently used electric vehicle, which is one of the things that we learned from California that they've done, along with outreach to the communities that are disproportionately affected by pollution. They're also helping to get people into those used, cleaner cars. The fluctuations, obviously, in the market are dramatic. When we have, again, a big storm, like a Katrina kind of storm that affects the Gulf of Mexico, or other kind of geopolitical events that we have no control over. Right now, the prices are actually pretty low. In Virginia, the last I checked, they were something like, $2.30 or something. I mean, I think most of us would acknowledge that probably doesn't really accurately reflect the true cost of everything that's associated with producing that oil and selling it here. But the idea of trying to use a program like this to get us weaned off of that so that those kind of variations don't really knock off any success of our economy is important. And I agree with the other comments that say that this kind of approach, in part because it's regional and does allow for these allowances to be spent in this way, should be less burdensome than a gasoline tax that would have to be done state by state.
Well, let's build on your last comment, Vicki, because we have a set of questions that go to that very question, which really get at what are the benefits of acting together in a multi-state coalition rather than states acting alone? And I know you're an expert on that topic in particular and very germane to TCI.
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, when you're talking about something like transportation and vehicles, they are moving across those state lines. So, one obvious benefit is it makes sense to tackle an issue like transportation emissions on a regional basis. It certainly makes sense when you're talking about things like, investing in alternative fuel corridors to look at that regionally. Some of these states have already been leaders in that, including with our neighbors to the north through agreements, for example, with Vermont and Quebec about that, making sure that people can actually drive their cleaner vehicles from place to place across the region. As I mentioned, taxes are difficult under, any estimation, although because these states have policies that require these reductions to take place, you do see the legislators getting very serious about carbon taxes that would affect this area and the people in the state, but you might not have some of the flexibility that you're seeing with this policy approach that has worked for the states and Reggie to allow these investments in certain ways that actually help move the needle even further. And one of the things that we've noticed from our work, not just in TCI, but on regional collaborations around adaptation, is that a regional collaboration actually provides for some benefit when you see changes in administration, in part because, you really have those kind of horizontal commitments as well as like the vertical commitments across your agencies, but also across your counterparts and other agencies throughout the region. And the state staff who actually are not the political appointees, but who really stay there year in and year out, really have benefited from the relationships and the sharing of best practices and all the hard work that's gone into this to help them meet their own in-state goals. And so I think that a regional program could be more robust than what you might see in a state that could easily flip in a new election. But what we've seen is that these regional partnerships, like with Reggie, have been very enduring and have been bipartisan at a time that's not generally bipartisan, as we all know. So I think those are some of the reasons that I would at least articulate why a regional policy approach is better. Certainly from a political standpoint, what we're hearing from the state leaders is that it makes it easier for any of them to take action because somebody's not going to just go right across the border and get gas from a neighboring state if they all hold hands and really take this action together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vicki. I don't know if you have anything to add. I love the image of all hold hands and doing this together because we are, in fact, in this together. That kind of leads into another set of questions that people are thinking about, and I know all three of you spend a fair bit of time looking at various climate policies as we do here at Ceres, and a couple of listeners are thinking climate policy is inevitable, and it's probably inevitable at the federal level. It's inevitable in various states in various ways, and I guess the questioner is wondering why TCI is better than some of the other policies that may be contemplated. Or feel free to comment and suggest that, TCI is part of the puzzle, but that it will take supporting policies as well. So it may not be the silver bullet, but I think the questioner is just wondering in the list of priorities among things they can support, why TCI now at this time. And so I open that up to any of the three of you who want to jump in.
This is JD. I guess for me, it's a piece of a puzzle, right? And there's a driving principle around a lot of this policy discussion, which is how do you use pricing to change behavior? And this is a component, this could be a component of that, right? So I know that there are some places out in other parts of the state or other parts of your states also, for those on the phone, who don't have options and you have to drive, and we need to account for that. There are also places where we need to do a better job creating options for people to drive single occupancy vehicles. So I think as we think about that guiding principle, this is a piece of that puzzle. It's certainly not the silver bullet, I don't think, but it is a strategy towards this larger goal, ultimately driven by meeting our global warming solutions act targets.
Yeah, thank you, JD.
No, that's right. I mean, if you're what I call a power user on gasoline or diesel, and those are exactly the people that we need to focus on in the first go-round in this. It may be that the first couple years, if you have a significant usage of gasoline or diesel in your business, you're hauling freight, or you're a person who travels long distances to work or school or things like that, those are the people we should be helping right out of the gate and working with those people to make sure that the alternatives are financially viable and they're agnostic as to what they drive, because I don't think people really care what they drive as long as it's cost effective and it gets them to where they want to go and there's enough charging stations and all the things that go along with it. So we're hoping we can make that person a supporter of this program by the proper outreach and the proper financial incentives. And that's why, we think it can work differently in different parts of the state, whereas in Eastern Mass it may be around public transportation and congestion. Western Mass may be getting people with electric vehicles a lot faster.
Thank you, Bob. And, your answer gets to the sort of other set of questions that, Vicki, I know you all in your center have given a lot of thought to, which is really to hone in on the non-urban areas, the places where congestion really isn't an issue, in rural areas in the various states. And I think the caller is interested in what is the set of arguments that you are putting forward to convince that set of residents, and in this case, in the business community, in those rural areas, how are we offering the kind of cost-benefit analysis to pull those constituents in, which is partly an equity issue, but it's broader than that when we think about our rural colleagues. And I know you've thought about this, so I'd love to hear your answer to those.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to start by taking a crack too at the last question because it really depends on what the person had in mind in terms of, why is TCI better than the other policies. I certainly wouldn't suggest, and I don't think the states would at all, that this is any substitute, for example, for the federal vehicle standards, which are being rolled back now. But I think, if anything, that whole exercise shows how important it is for states to fill some of that gap. We talked a little bit about tax versus caps and invest. Caps provide certainty of the environmental result as opposed to just the price certainty, although there's a way that you can have boundaries on what the price might do. Even in a cap and invest program, it certainly generates the proceeds, so you're not only having that price signal that people might think will even get higher over time, so then they will adjust their behaviors accordingly according to that incentive, but allows for investment, as we've heard, in priorities that make sense for the communities that you're dealing with, including cleaner school buses, which, whether you're in a rural area or an urban area, if you care about what our kids are breathing, the diesel pollution from behind the buses can be more dangerous than standing in front of a bus. And so getting some of the kids out of buses and the people who use them for transit, cleaning the bus depots and ports and other sources of local air pollution, no matter where you are in the region, I think can really make a difference and provide some win-wins. In terms of some of the other ideas for rural areas, helping to stimulate and support van pools with the use of telecommunications technologies and put people together for those trips, those combined trips. Again, as I mentioned earlier, looking at getting people into cleaner vehicles. My Bolt goes 300 miles or so on a charge, so I don't really have a lot of range anxiety, but you can drive quite a bit with that. But having some infrastructure to let people know, including in those areas, that there are places that they can charge if they need to take longer trips. Cash for clunkers program, so that people can get rid of some of their older vehicles that are gas guzzlers and get into more efficient vehicles, even if it's not electric. And I think there are even some creative options that the states themselves might want to consider. It's really going to be up to them and their stakeholders, but some of the things that we've talked about in the process of TCI and heard from stakeholders is, the use of broadband as an alternative to driving. If you provided, when streets and roads are being opened, opportunities for companies to go in and lay cable so that people can have access to jobs that way, and training and schooling and telemedicine and things like that. There could be really some important win-wins for people in rural areas if that is what the powers that be in the states decide to do with this money. I know that in PennDOT, they do use the opportunity to coordinate with the people who are providing that broadband to rural areas when they're opening up the roads. So there is a nexus to that. I don't know if that's something that the states will pursue, but that's just one other example.
Well, thank you for that, Vicki, and in particular, thank you for highlighting the health impacts that hadn't yet come up on this webinar, and it's obviously of vital importance as we make this transition. And also great that you mentioned range anxiety and that you don't have it. I often wonder if people don't have range anxiety, it's really about change anxiety, it seems to me, that we really have to tackle. So a question that builds on what you just said actually has come in that I don't think we've adequately addressed, which is how much leeway or autonomy will individual states have to spend the revenue under the TCI model? So
the draft MOU or the announcement last year, I should say, talks about the states investing it in the transportation sectors in their states for resilience purposes, and we also didn't get into that. But frankly, these states are facing these challenges in part because of climate change and the extreme weather that we're seeing, and that actually costs money. To build bridges and roads differently, to have bigger culverts to carry the water that's more intense when storms come, like we saw with the culverts and bridges being knocked out in Irene, for example, in Vermont. So, that's one area that the states can spend money, in addition to ways that help provide people these transportation alternatives to, more accessible, reliable transit or cleaner vehicles and fuels. And that really, so far is contemplated as a state decision that they make with their stakeholders and their legislatures, and in many cases, I would expect.
Okay, thank you for that, Vicky. We're getting down to the wire here. If there are any last questions, you can please put them into the chat function. But there is a question about, and you alluded to this ever so briefly, Vicky, but it was how does the TCI program compare and or work with programs in California or Quebec?
So they're similar in some ways. So we certainly heard from not just California and Quebec, but also people in British Columbia, which has had a carbon tax for some time, in the deliberations over the years that the states have had in thinking about this issue. California has had a comprehensive greenhouse gas emission reduction program that is a lot of different sectors under a cap, and so that has created a price signal and generated revenues, and we've learned how they've invested in some of the communities, including those that have been disproportionately affected by pollution, with some of those revenues. So that's where I'm drawing some of those examples, like, gently used electric vehicles, for example. But directly in terms of any kind of, specific plan to link to those programs, that's not really at this time something that the states are working on. It's more just like, sharing best practices and learning from each other. And of course, in the case of New England and the Eastern Canadian provinces, there's other relationships through CONEG and longstanding relationships, including around trade, but also around electric vehicle deployment, around the use of hydropower and things like that. And so, I think that that's very complementary to TCI's goals. But right now, the jurisdictions that are really in this conversation are the ones from Virginia and BC up through Maine, and that's it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Vicky. Really helpful. In a moment, I'm going to ask each of our three panelists if there's any concluding 30-second remarks they want to offer the group before we close. Let me just offer that, if it's helpful, here at Ceres, we'd be happy to share contact people in each of the states who are working on TCI for chambers that might be interested in connecting with state representatives who are working on the TCI development process. There's a lot of resources right here that we're more than happy to connect and work on collaboration together. JD mentioned that we have an event coming up on December 11th with our governor, and it's close to the holidays, but interestingly, it's standing room only at this point, and we're happy to share the reviews of that event in really sharing this message. You saw the very tight timeline on the slide earlier, so we're moving quickly. All of us on this call are very much here to be a resource for those of you who called in, and I just wanted to make that offer. So in no particular order, I'm going to turn to our panelists for their final concluding remarks. I want to thank each of them for putting in this time. Obviously, they all have a tremendous amount to share. They're deeply invested in making TCI work, make it successful, and making sure that the forward-thinking business voice is a part of this. So let me turn to my colleagues in the room, and your final word, Bob.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to everybody who's been on the line. I think it's been a great conversation. I mean, the ultimate goal of TCI is to go out of business. The goal is to get to zero, and the faster you get to zero, the faster TCI goes away in your state. So in some ways, it's the very definition of a temporary fee. You have an ability to move your state in ways that you will not pay a TCI fee anymore, and that's the best thing to do for the environment as well as, the people in your state. So, our version of this is to get people into these alternative vehicles as they become available, as they become cost effective, and to get our businesses to zero at some point.
Thank you, Bob. JD?
Yeah, I'm excited about the model we have here. It feels like the business community here is working very collaboratively with each other, very collaboratively with the environmental community, and very collaboratively with government. And that feels like a good path that we're on to success. And as Ann mentioned, if folks want to contact me separately about how to engage, I feel like the process that we have laid out here provides a very clear path for engagement for the business community to be impactful. And I'm happy to help others think that through in their states.
Thank you for that offer, JD. Appreciate that. Vicky, your final thoughts?
Sure. So, I want to thank all of you, Ann, Bob, JD, and all of you who are taking time out to be on this call and learn about the Transportation and Climate Initiative. If you want to learn more, you can go to transportationandclimate.org. I do think that there really are important health and economic benefits that could be recognized through a policy like this. And we're really excited about hearing more from the business community about what you see happening and what you would like to see as a future transportation system that is better from a health and a climate perspective. I think all of us, especially if we have kids or just, are concerned about the young people who are speaking out about climate change and future generations yet to be born, it sometimes feels overwhelming. But I think something like TCI gives a lot of people hope that we can really tackle this problem. But it does need to happen, and we do need to make a start, and it might not be perfect, but we need to really take a step forward. And so really I'm asking you to really engage with us and engage with people in your state and figure out a constructive way to be part of this dialogue. Thank you very much for your interest.
Well, thank you so much, Vicky, JD, and Bob, and to our listeners for joining us today. You will be hearing from us. We appreciate your engagement. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ann.